at the highest level of tournament play, you tend to notice that the best teams, the most successful teams, they kind of look really similar, right? Like the players are all using variations on a very limited set of strategies. That is no accident. And by best and most successful, I mean teams and team styles that are going to win consistently, reliably, over and over and over and over again. They're so good that you can know they're coming and still struggle to beat them. That's why they're so good, right? So the opposite of this would be, let's say, a very flashy team that in any given game can blow the opponent out of the water and just make them look ridiculous. But it would be incredibly hard-pressed to pull that kind of thing off repeatedly, because a lot of its strength comes from surprise, and once that surprise is no longer in play nearly as much, once those more explosive teams' blind spots are more exploited, once there is awareness of them, then they cease to really be as effective as they were at first. But the most consistent stuff, then that, it's coming and it's still going to be really tough to beat. That's what makes it so consistent. So this video is not really about that battle between those two. I don't even want to call them extremes, but rather using extremes to try and target the more successful stuff. But by going extreme, then you open yourself up to other things. That's not quite what this video is about. What I'm talking about more is that these consistent team styles, so, in Gen 3 we'll say, Skarmory and friends, then they are the gatekeepers of the metagame. If something is good, it has to be consistently viable into them. They set the boundaries for the metagame. Now, this is not to say those boundaries can't be pushed. Of course not. That's a big part of what being creative and being successful is all about, finding new ways to target these things. But by and large, there is that whole fundamental thing, no matter how you twist it, Skarmory is going to be elite in advance, right? So, you have that, and then you consider that these gatekeepers being gatekeepers in the first place, this is a good thing. For example, offensive Starmie rips offense up so badly. But to a certain extent, having such gatekeepers is good. Now, to what extent it's healthy is a subject of great debate. But generally, you like a more limited metagame as opposed to one where literally everything is viable, to just go all the way, where everything is viable and the options for dealing with these things is too stretched out. That's when metagames have problems. When you start having to pick and choose your matchup, poison. It's too difficult to counter a reasonable portion of the metagame with one team, so you just start praying you don't face X or Y. That's when you run into problems. That's why having gatekeepers is good. And this is not to say that it's going to really deplete you or deprive you of creativity, because the creativity comes from working within that established framework, and that framework means competitive metagame. Good, right? However, it can still be frustrating with how limiting certain aspects of the game can be, right? As much as I love Skarmory, I can also be frustrated by it. You know what? Because it's natural to want to use something else once in a while. And a lot of tournament players go through this. They're like, well, I'm really successful with insert comfortable, reliable style here, right? But maybe I should switch it up. Let me try using some of those offense teams that I always run into. And then you try those offense teams. This is not an anti-offense thing, by the way. We're getting to the Will-o-Wisp thing, I promise. You run it. You try those offense teams, and at first, oh, this is kind of fun. And then you think about it a little more, or offense teams, or bad balance teams, if you want to, basically, after you try these different kinds of teams, then you realize, hey, why am I struggling against the same type of style I'm so successful with? Oh, right, because that style is good, and these styles are actually terrible, and I'm trying to have variety for the sake of variety. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to have variety. I mean, we're playing Pokemon, for God's sake. But it can be frustrating sometimes with how limited your options are if you really want to be viable. You know, that whole viable versus taking extreme risks things. So, you know, I've mentioned some gatekeepers already. You know, Skarmory, Offensive Starmie. Aerodactyl is a huge one. Blissey, of course, you know, talking strictly in advanced terms. But I think an underrated gatekeeper of an advanced OU, if you want to make a good team, you have to be good into Will-o-Wisp. And this produces some really limited options, you know. And I see a lot of teams that would be really good, but they are held back because they have to accommodate for Will-o-Wisp. Or if they don't accommodate for Will-o-Wisp, then they're just completely destroyed by it. You know, this is not just a theoretical team builder thing. I see people bringing this stuff to tournaments all the time. It's like, oh no, I'll be fine. Will-o-Wisp, it's just Will-o-Wisp, you know? You don't think of Will-o-Wisp in the same way you do Skarmory or Aerodactyl or, you know, Metagross, whatever. You think Will-o-Wisp, you know, it's something you play around, right? And now I ask you, okay, how do you play around Will-o-Wisp? You know, there are two Will-o-Wisp users in Advanced OU, Gengar and Moltres. And if it was just Gengar, or just Moltres, but Gengar is the more defining one. So if it was just Gengar, it'd be one thing. But when you add Moltres, then you limit the options even further because they have very, very different answers. So they do have some answers that overlap, of course, Blissey being the most obvious one. And Pursuit T-Tar, while not a great answer to Moltres, is good enough. And in the sense that, yes, okay, you are not going to be amazing into Moltres, but you don't mind it getting burned as much as your other Pokemon. So you switch that into that, and you kind of chip it. You can Crunch, Pursuit, maybe you run Rock Slide on it just to force the issue a little more if Moltres stays in, because even a burn Rock Slide is going to hit it really hard. And or you pivot into another Pokemon with the subsequent HP Grass, whatever. Right? It's just to help soak that burn. And you think, all right, well, look, if soaking burn with Pursuitar is acceptable into Gengar, but because you're pursuing it super effectively, so you're removing it or very close in the case of Spadefgar, right? So why do you? I should probably click this replay. I forgot it was here. This replay does show what I mean, because Sadly's team has both Moltres and Gengar. Yeah, so with Gengar it's acceptable because you're KOing it or close to it with Pursuitar, but with Moltres it's totally not worth it. You know, why absorb the Wisp with Pursuit T-Tar? And I'm like, okay, totally fair. What else do you absorb it with? That's the problem. The list of Pokemon... It's not that there's a short list of Pokemon that absorb Will-o-Wisp from Moltres viably. You know, it's that you can't really fit those on every team. You know, and with the Gengar thing, if you have stuff like Pursuitar and Blissey, I mean, those don't always go together, because one of the ways you deal with Will-o-Wisp is Natural Cure. But the Natural Curers, Celebi, Starmie, and Blissey. Blissey's the only one that overlaps. Starmie loves switching into Moltres. Well, defensive Starmie anyway. But even offensive Starmie, you know, will take the pivot. Because you can't have something ruined by Will-o-Wisp when a Will-o-Wisp Pokemon comes in, right? You cannot have no option to switch into it. Now, you can get creative in playing around it, for sure. There are many options. We'll mention some of them. But you can't have none. Otherwise, you get, like, disastrous tournament games where, you know, Gengar comes in and just Will-o-Wisps the daylights out of everything. And it's like, oh, well, I guess I lose to Wisp Gengar. I didn't expect to see, you know, stuff like that. So, yeah, so here's the issue. Moltres, Will-o-Wisp is stopped by Blissey. You know, we'll just take Blissey for granted because it defeats everything anyway, because Blissey's broken. But it also helps with Gengar, right? It's like the one overlap against both. So, and Pursuitar, kinda. Because Pursuitar is good for Gengar, and obviously dealing with both Gengar and Moltres is extremely challenging for Pursuitar, so you gotta be mindful of it in other ways. But it can help, right? Because if you're using Pursuitar to deal with Moltres, Moltres' burn, then you're doing it because your team is otherwise so offensive that you can't really afford to run a better check for it, right? So it's not a good answer, it's a good enough answer to facilitate your other Pokemon, okay? So, some other reliable answers. Moltres is obviously the go-to for Milotic is obviously the go-to for Moltres because it refreshes off burns. Not to say that that can't get hairy, but look, we're not talking complete immunities here, right? Some stall teams have used Rest Moltres for things like this, and also for dealing with things like Beat Up Charizard. More on Beat Up Charizard later, actually, but yeah. So Rest Moltres, that's as specific as you get. That's extremely niche, very hard to fit. Milotic is already hard to fit, right? So then you've got your Natural Cure Starmie that can help, and other than that, it's really, you're not going to have much in the way of super reliable choices. You can have lots of ways to play around it, like maybe you pivot around it with like a combination of Pursuit Tar and like Rest Hog Zapdos. You have to have your offensive options to deal with it, right? Like maybe you have an offensive Zapdos that switches into HP Grass, or an Aerodactyl, willing that you're going to avoid the Wisp, right? Things like that. I might be overlooking something, but like offensive teams are also going to be more at home with this because they can do things like a Lum T-Tar, right, to help out. Or they can pivot into the Wisp with Charizard, and respond that way. So they have options. But, like even Suicune, which is otherwise a good Moltres answer, or a decent Moltres answer at the very least, before Sand and Spikes come into the picture, then like Will-o-Wisp, like offensive Suicune, congrats, it's ruined. If it's Rest Talk offensive Suicune, then that's fine. But to deal with the burn, you're still resting. So the Moltres user really loves that. It's like, okay, well, that's the whole point of burn. Either it cripples them forever, or they have to do something obnoxious to deal with it, right? And if you're running Heal Bell, Blissey, then you already have a Blissey for Moltres. If you're running Heal Bell Celebi, then you're not switching into the Moltres. So you have to let something else that take... I mean, look, stuff like that, Suicune, Celebi, we're not getting into the super specifics. All I'm pointing out is that it's limited. Now, with Gengar, obviously your own Moltres is also a decent stopgap to other Moltres. Nothing like using something to counter itself. And I've also thought about things like Rest Flygon with Heal Bell Celebi. That one's like okay, because it's not as vulnerable to passive damage, unlike Suicune. I also thought about like a more offensive team with Refresh Mixments. Because Mixments has so much variability to its moveset anyway, that you could toss on Refresh. And it's not just good for Moltres, of course. It's good for Toxics, T-Waves, whatever. But it really is hard to fit, right? That's the whole point I'm making. Will-o-Wisp is... Because these Wisps are coming from fast, offensively threatening Pokemon. So, with good defensive profiles. You can't just limit their switch-ins. So... That's why it's tough to switch into Moltres. Now, think about Gengar Will-o-Wisp. Gengar comes equipped with Thunderbolt and Ice Punch, so you can forget the Refresh Mixments thing, or the Rest Flygon thing. Yeah, so with Thunderbolt and Taunt, so you can't even say, oh, well, Milotic takes Thunderbolts fine and, refreshes and recovers. Yeah, well, take your Wisp, take the T-Bolt, and then, it gets taunted and ruined anyway. Not to mention it's a dicey proposition to begin with. That Thunderbolt also means Starmie doesn't want to switch into it. Celebi is definitely able to switch into Gengar, decently. I mean, you got to watch out for Sand and Spikes, but Ice Punch is not as strong as Thunderbolt, so you can pivot around it. And it absorbs Will-o-Wisp from it like nothing else, of course. So there is an option for Gengar that isn't available against Moltres. But again, I'm mentioning how limited this is. So, the whole Waters thing is not really applicable to Gengar, nor is the Moltres or Charizard thing. Like, offensive teams are not going to be so well off that they can afford to do something better than pivot Charizard into Will-o-Wisp, and then if the Gengar Thunderbolts, it'll knock Charizard into Blaze range, and it'll get taken out by Fire Blast, right? That's just part of running offense. That's reasonable. But the options are difficult. I mean, you could also say, oh, well, Swampert, Refresh Swampert is okay, but again, Taunt. And also Gengar sometimes likes to run Giga Drain, so dealing with it is very dicey. So these two don't even need to be run on the same team together like they are on Sadly's team here. It's just their presence alone in the metagame is incredibly restrictive, and one I thought was worth mentioning because Wisp is just such an incredibly powerful move, and it kind of gets overlooked because, I mean, even Toxic gets overlooked. But yeah, Will-o-Wisp is very overlooked and very, as suffocating to deal with in the team builder. To say nothing of in battle. And before anyone says, "Oh well, Will-o-Wisp can miss," and I'm telling you, if you are relying on Will-o-Wisp missing as part of your gameplay, like, look, if you get into a game and you have to rely on it missing at some point, then that, once in a while, of course, that's just you playing to your odds. But if you design a team that is Will-o-Wisp weak and you say, oh, it's fine because they're not going to hit every Will-o-Wisp, then you really deserve to lose. And I have seen this kind of mentality before. I don't mean, like, playing around Will-o-Wisp with, like, Lumberries and forcing them to hit repeated Will-o-Wisps. That's just good. But it's not like you're making a team weak to Will-o-Wisp and saying it's fine because they're going to miss. But also another option that opens up for Gengar that's kind of okay is Lum Metagross on offense. It's pretty fine. And some players like to use Magneton because Magneton's a pretty good absorber against Gengar. But of course, then you have I'm not even going to get into the Will-o-Wisp Pokemon are obscenely busted alongside Dugtrio thing and Spikes. Dealing with the Wisp. Which is why they're so commonly paired with Sand and Spikes. Hard to fit, Doug in there as well, but you generally have to pick and choose. But it's still a very, very, very nasty set of Pokemon to deal with. And of course, they partner beautifully with my beloved Hariyama. I think that's pretty much everything. I might have overlooked something, but I just wanted to bring attention to this important issue, which is that Will-o-Wisp is an overlooked gatekeeper of Advance OU, and it is crazy restrictive. And a lot of teams out there would otherwise be quite good, but you got to deal with the Wisp. I mean, it's as simple as, oh, I really want to run the superior physical T-Tar, but I have to run special instead. I have to run Pursuit. And, I mean, that's not bad, but it would be much better to run physical, but I can't because Will-o-Wisp. And, I mean, this is what team building is all about, right? Knowing that you have to compromise on some things because you have to deal with the threats in the metagame. But I just wanted to highlight how Will-o-Wisp has this presence in Advance. So, thank you for watching/listening. I hope this was enjoyable/fun/whatever for you, and I will see you in the next one.